Hello again. I know it seems like you're seeing me off and on here. Joel and I are in discussions, getting schedules back up and going. You're going to be seeing a lot of me in June. Speaking again in a couple of weeks, so please don't worry. I'm not kind of feathering in and out. We are working at a full schedule again. But if you can just, in this week, if you can just pray for my family. It's been an interesting 2025 for us. My older daughter was pretty sick in February with a flu, and she got better, and as a loving daughter does, she was kind enough to pass part of that flu on to me. And that's what opened the door to the medical journey that I had. My other daughter, Lily, got sick with a whole separate thing that had nothing to do with our flus, and she missed a few days of school. When I got home, I was recovering, as I shared with you, and for about a week and a half, we were all healthy. And then my older daughter got another flu, as loving sisters do. She gave it to our other daughter, who's recovering now, but my wife, being the absolute angel that she is, being around trying to help everybody, caught that flu, so she is pretty sick right now. Somewhere I feel like we must have kicked a black cat through a broken mirror or something, because if you can just take a moment and pray that the Lord would have his hand. But on a positive note, though, like I said, we are getting things in motion again. We have the Men's Summit coming up this May, and I am going to be meeting with the elders. We have plans coming up, things we want to introduce to you guys, things we want to put into play. So I know we've been a little bit on our back foot for the last few weeks, but full steam ahead. And last week, even though it felt a little like a testimony or a little bit of a devotional time, last week really was the first in a series where I'm talking about key moments in Christ's ministry on earth. And last week we talked about that moment where the Father forsook the Son when he was on the cross. And the idea was that because Christ suffered on the cross while being abandoned by his Father, that allows him to totally understand anything that we're going through in our solitude. And so the challenge was really to take your pain, take the moments where you feel the most alone, and give those to Christ. He's going to understand it. He's going to meet you in your loneliness and in what you're going through. But continuing on this week, what I want to talk about this week is temptation. And basically, this is a good way to sum it up. The idea is how to deal with temptation, how to deal when things come into your life and you have a good or a bad decision to make. And I already know which decision I would have made, and sorry, it's not the fruit. I'm a cop. I'm always going to go for the donut. What I want to talk about is what it is to really be tempted by the devil, what it really is. And often Satan gets us to fall into temptation because he uses methods that we didn't expect. He uses an approach that we never saw coming. And what he kind of does is he targets weaknesses that we didn't know we had. And when I was a kid and we were in South America, a lot of evangelism teams would come. And even in the United States, evangelism was huge, coming out of that big hippie movement in California with basically what they call the Jesus movement. But one of the things that these evangelistic teams would do in the 70s and early 80s is they would pass out these little comics. I don't know why they were called this, but they were called chick comics. And what they were is they had little cartoons with people inside, and they would open it up and you'd see everything that's happening to these people. They're facing all these temptations and things. And these little chick comics would carry a very unmistakable evangelical message. So they weren't bad. They were good. Me personally, I didn't always care for them. And I'll tell you why. One of the things I noticed is that the way they always portrayed Satan was very similar. Satan was a goat-like figure with horns, and he either had a big bag of drugs or a six-pack or a filthy magazine in his hand, and that's what he was tempting people with. And what kind of bothered me is that this portrayed Satan as somebody that you could spot a mile away. And in reality, Satan is a lot more subtle. He's a lot more underhanded. He will attack you in areas that you didn't even know you were weak. And my father once said in a message that everyone does have a price that if you meet, they will be willing to sell out their values. Satan's job is to find that price and meet it. And I remember the movie I saw once. You know me, sooner or later it comes back to a movie because I'm a movie fiend, I'm sorry. But it was a movie called The Devil's Advocate. And what it was about is a young lawyer who was being recruited to work for this prestigious firm that was being led by this older, really ferocious, well-talented lawyer. And in the middle of the movie, it comes out that this older, wise lawyer was actually Satan himself. And what was happening is the movie was showing this older lawyer trying to get the young lawyer to abandon his values and ultimately serve him. It's not an easy movie to watch. If you do watch it, I don't recommend gathering the kids around and getting popcorn. But in the movie, there's a scene toward the end where there's this really awful argument, battle going back and forth between Satan and this young lawyer. And the young lawyer finally leaves the firm, gets away from everything, and it looks like he's returned to his values and who he is. But at the very end of the movie, in the very last scene, he's back in his real world, everything's good, and a reporter comes up to this young lawyer and says, "Hey, I'd like to interview you. I'd like to talk to you about all the great cases that you've won. I think I can make you a star." And this smile crosses the lawyer's face, and he's like, "Yeah, I can do that. You're on. I'll do an interview." And he walks away with this stride and newfound arrogance. Well, the camera goes back to the reporter, and the reporter's face morphs into the lawyer who was Satan. Well, what's the point of the movie and that scene? One way or another, Satan is going to get you. Now, before you start picking up rocks and getting ready to stone a second Stephen, I don't think we have to live in that fear that Satan is ultimately going to get us, because Scripture is very clear. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. So I am not trying to sell the idea that we need to live in petrified fear of Satan ultimately winning. But there is a point that I'm after, and that is that I do believe Satan gains entry into our lives because we assume we can see him coming. And what we assume is that he's going to use the front door and walk in with obvious sin, and there he goes, and we can be like, "No, Satan, I'm too good for that. I wouldn't do that." Well, that's not what he does. Instead, he comes through the back door with roses and chocolate. He comes in ways that you don't see. It could be a family member. It could be a friend. It could be that coworker of the opposite gender that just seems to be so easy to talk to. He can come in a lot of ways. And the key to fighting temptation, the key to really being able to stand up to Satan, is to understand how Satan targets us. What weaknesses does he look for? What back door is he looking for? And I think the answer to those questions can be found in examining a key moment in Jesus' life, how Jesus was tempted by Satan in the desert. I think that confrontation, that exchange, shows us so much about the nature of how Satan attacks us. And we're going to read through it. But don't worry, we're going to go back and break up the passage, but we're just going to take a look at the whole temptation exchange together. It's in Luke 4, verses 1 through 13. And it says, "Then Jesus, being filled with the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being tempted for 40 days by the devil. And in those days he ate nothing. And afterwards, when they had ended, he was hungry. And the devil said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread.' But Jesus answered him, saying, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God." Well, the devil took him up on a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, "All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me." Key point. We're going to get back to that sentence. This has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all of this will be yours. And Jesus answered and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only will you serve." Well, then he brought him up to Jerusalem, set Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you, to keep you. And in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It has been said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God." That's an incredible exchange. And you have to look at how Satan is tempting Jesus here. He's not being clumsy. He's not being random. He's not asking Jesus, he's not tempting him to turn a cow into a dinosaur. He's not tempting Jesus to make it snow and suddenly have Santa come down the chimney. Picking specific ways to tempt Jesus. And what happens is oftentimes the way we are tempted falls into these ways. Now, I'm going to diverge here for a second if you can follow me. It's going to sound like I'm saying something that has nothing to do with this, but it is related. I saw on a talk show once this comedian Bill Maher. He has people come on and talk, and he said, "You know what? I think the Ten Commandments are foolish. They're stupid. You want to know why? Because they don't address every single sin. I want one that addresses pedophiles. I want one that addresses drug dealers." And I looked at the TV and I was like, "Oh, Bill, you don't get it. The Ten Commandments are valid. Because if you look at them carefully, the origin of any sin you commit can be brought back to one of the Ten Commandments. If somebody is a pedophile, what are they doing? They're desiring a child. Thou shalt not covet. You want something at work and you don't get it? Thou shalt not covet. You're talking bad about your neighbor or somebody in your church? Thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. The bottom line is any sin that we commit, if we look at what caused that sin, it can be back to one of the Ten Commandments. I think the same principle applies here. Satan attacks Jesus in three ways. And what's funny is I know you guys are like, "Wow, Steve, you love your 3 points." I do, but Scripture did it for me here. I didn't. He attacks him in 3 ways that I think show any temptation that we have, anything that we're tempted through, can almost be rooted back to one of the 3 ways that Jesus tempts Satan. So what I want to do is go back now and actually look at this passage, divide it up in 3 ways, and let's take a look at where Satan decides to turn the screws. And in verse 3, this is the first part of it. He says, "And the devil said to him, if you are the Son of God, command this stone to be turned to bread." Well, what temptation is Satan really targeting here? It's the ability and the temptation to fill your own need instead of letting God fill it. It's not just about being hungry. Jesus had a craving. Jesus was lacking. And rather than relying on the Father, Satan is tempting him to fulfill his own need. Now this, obviously we can go through the obvious checkpoints. Somebody takes drugs, they're fulfilling a need. Somebody drinks too much. Somebody is looking at inappropriate material on the computer or on their phone. We can do that all day. We all have things that we shouldn't do, blah, blah, blah. But this is also a very subtle sin. We are tempted to fill our life with things because we are unsatisfied. And rather than letting God reach us and fulfill our life, we are too impatient. We want the answer now. We want the fulfillment now. So we feed ourselves with something that God did not want us to have, instead of waiting for Him to fill that need. That is taking a stone and turning it into bread. And when you look at your own life, that's the temptation. Even when we pray sometimes. Believe me, right now I've been praying, Lord, just make my family healthy, please. And we don't get an answer to prayer. Okay, you know what? I'm going to go out and fix the problem myself. There's things that we want in life. There's things that we think we need. And rather than waiting for the Lord to fill that cavity, we go ahead and fill it ourselves, and we prematurely turn stone into bread. That's what that's what Satan is targeting here, is he's trying to goad Jesus into filling himself instead of allowing the Father to fill him and fulfill a plan. But you go on to the second part. We go temptation number 2 in verse 5. Then the devil took him up on a high mountain, showed him all of the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and the devil said to him, all this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all will be yours. Why am I fascinated with this part? All this has been delivered to me. What Satan is saying in plain English is that the kingdoms of the world he's been allowed to have dominion over. These kingdoms already belong to him. That's why he's in a place that he can offer it to Jesus, because they belong to him. What this does is, I know a fair amount of us are, political enthusiasts. For me, it's a junkie, but political enthusiasts. The danger is for us to believe that God is blessing a nation and God stands behind a nation when we don't realize that nation may already belong to Satan. We're praying for the wrong thing. A lot of times people pray that every person in the United States becomes a born-again Christian, and that it's Christian nirvana all over again. What we should be praying for is that our household can withstand the temptation of society. I'm not condemning the United States. I'm saying don't fall into the trap that the whole world is good and God is behind every nation and we just need to trust people. Satan has his footing in more nations than you realize. He even says it here. These things have been given to me. The whole reason Satan can offer Jesus these worlds, these kingdoms, is because they belong to him. So what's the temptation that Satan is throwing out here? It's the desire to have power or authority over something that God did not intend for you to have authority over. The whole way that salvation works is that Jesus is submitting to God's plan. All Jesus has to do is to decide, you know what? I'm in it for myself. Yeah, you know what? I don't mind being a king. Had he given into this temptation, the cross would have never happened. Now, you may say, you know what, Steve? I don't want to be a king. I don't want to be a president. I don't even want to be a sultan. So I don't have to worry about this temptation. You're talking to the wrong person. I don't want to be a king over a land. That's not what he's talking about. What Satan is targeting is our desire to have authority where we shouldn't. And how many times do we secretly position ourselves, do we secretly make little moves where we become a head of a committee, or we become a head of this group, or we're all of a sudden leading that? Well, how did he become in charge of that? I don't know, just kind of he said this and the two met for lunch and that happened. How did she head up this? Well, how many times do we do little things to gain that advantage? And I'll tell you something. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've had people come up to me and they look at me, and in case you think your eyesight is failing you, I am short and I'm brown. So people will come up to me and they feel like they already have the advantage. They're taller, they're bigger, they're whatever. And they do that thing, that Trump does. They shake your hand and they kind of just turn it a bit to let you know that they have the authority. They put one hand on the arm, pretending they're embracing you. What they're establishing is, I physically have dominion over you during this conversation. And I'm mature enough that I'm like, I'll let you have these 5 minutes if it makes you feel better, because a little bit later I'll be at Cracker Barrel and the world will be fine. So you can have it. But we do that. We do little things to just kind of get that upper hand. Even in conversations, sometimes we want to dominate the conversation. Or sometimes we want to maneuver things so that other people have to kind of submit to us. That's the temptation Satan is targeting. The desire to have authority in an area you weren't intended to have it. He's offering Jesus a chance to be ruler of everything. Satan knows, I don't care about you being a ruler. My real goal is, if you decide to be in it for yourself, salvation goes out the door and I win. He wants Jesus to break from the understanding that God is the authority in your life. You are not. And he wants Jesus to step over that boundary. That's the second temptation. And you get to the third one, and it's like, this one's kind of interesting, but we read through it in verse 9. Then Satan brought Jesus to Jerusalem, set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you, to keep you. And in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. This one's tricky. What's the temptation here? What it is the temptation to make reckless choices with the assumption that God will bail you out. And this is a tricky one, because this isn't obvious, like taking a 12-pack and drinking yourself to oblivion, or pulling out a bag of crack and hoping you can sail down there, robbing a bank. This isn't an obvious temptation. And it's a tricky one. I really dug into this one, because it's like, what is Satan really targeting? What Satan wanted was for Jesus to begin to be reckless, rather than trusting what the Lord had for him to do. He wanted Jesus to mock God by testing his ability to intervene. And what it really is it's asking the Lord to do something that you have no right to ask. And it's like, okay, well, how do I do this in my life, Steve? I'm not going to go up to the San Francisco Bridge and be like, God, catch me. What it is sometimes we make decisions that we don't realize are affecting our ability to live for the Lord. It's affecting the happiness of people around us. It's affecting our loved ones. We're making decisions that are tearing us apart and affecting our ability to be whole and to grow. And I want to make a distinction here, because there's a link that somebody can make, and I don't want us to go wrong on this. Sometimes I'm a little tough on missionaries. My parents were one. The temptation for missionaries is, because they're the only authority where they go and there's nobody to double check them, they tend to become their own conscience. And it's hard for missionaries to check with other believers, am I living out of hand? Could I be doing this differently? So sometimes missionaries start to go over the edge a bit, and you have to kind of tell them, no, this is what can and can't happen. But when missionaries go out and serve the Lord, is there danger? Yes. Could they be arrested? Yes. Could they even be killed? Yes. That's not recklessness. What they've done is they've sat down, reviewed what's happening, what's possible, and said, Lord, I'm still willing to go. That's a pact between them and the Lord. Not that God will save them, but they are stepping out despite what's possible. What I am talking about here is when we make decisions that put us right in the face of recklessness, right in the face of danger, things that could totally break us or our family, and we expect God to bail us out. That's the recklessness that Satan is addressing here. And I'll give you an example. In the church I grew up with, there was once a man who showed up out of the clear blue in this big RV, just driving around, and his wife and 3 kids, and they all got out of the van and walked into the church. Hi, we'd like to fellowship. Okay. The kids looked a little unkept, but, life happens, whatever. And they came in, and he said that what he wanted is the Lord had put it on his heart to visit every single church that he could possibly visit in the United States and get to know them and fellowship with them. And we thought, well, not a bad way to go, but okay, that's, we can try. Yeah, it's a noble thought. But it almost instantly became clear that this was a mistake. When you talk to the kids, they were disheveled, they were sick, they looked sick. They had massive behavior issues because they had been confined to this RV for months, traveling everywhere. They had no socialization. The mom was trying to homeschool them. It was going awful. They were behind schedule. They were always getting punished by the dad because they couldn't. Kids are not meant to be in an RV for 7 or 8 months a year. And finally, the elders of this church pulled the man aside and they said, look, we understand your heart. This is not a safe way to go forward in what you think God should be doing. This may not be the best way to do it. Well, he gathered up the kids and his wife, and he walked out the door, whatever, in a huff, and he turned around and he said, I'll tell you something. You need to trust your children the same way I do trust my children with God. And the elders were like, what? And what he was trying to say was, this is all good under God's umbrella. My children will be fine. You need to learn to have the same faith in God. What he didn't understand was, in the name of trust, he was carrying out things that were destroying his children's demeanor, their upbringing, their development. He was severely hurting his family under the foolish assumption that God will fix everything. And we felt a great burden for them. We knew that was going to be a long time for those kids. But there's another example that's more closer to home, that the high school that I graduated from, in the 70s and the 80s, being a Christian high school, they got good enrollment. They had a lot of kids. They were healthy. And in the late 80s, early 90s, for some reason unknown, the principal and administrator of that school, Tom Whitcamper, decided to take the earnings of the school and the portfolios of the teachers and put them on the stock market to try to make more money and enrich the school. And so he hired a Christian stockbroker that he knew, and the stockbroker gathered all this up. The idea was to put it on the stock market. The Lord will bless this church, because the Lord always blesses. That's what was supposed to happen. What really happened was the stockbroker took the hundreds of thousands of dollars that he'd been given, and he disappeared to Florida. And the school was bankrupted overnight. Teachers had to practically work for free. They lost their retirement savings, so they were done. The school could no longer afford its buildings. It had to start selling off assets, all kinds of things. And ultimately, Tom Whitcamper, rightfully so, was fired as the principal. The reason I say his name is because I think when you do something like that to the kingdom, you deserve to have your name up on the wall. I'm not going to let him hide. There was another man, Mark Mackay, who came in as the principal and almost single-handedly kept the school alive, doing different things. And it took about 10 or 15 years. The school finally leveled out. It's now healthy. Both my kids have gone to this school. They've come back. But one man's misunderstanding, or one man's foolish assumption about how God blesses, collapsed this school. What Satan is targeting in this temptation is for you to go out and do things that you know are foolish, that you know are dangerous, that you know are hurting your family. You know this is risky. You know you probably shouldn't be doing this, but it's okay because God's going to bail me out by sunset. That's the temptation he wants you to give into, is to live recklessly in the name of the Lord. And Jesus' response, I loved it. Because it's basically, he's saying, you shall not provoke, you shall not tempt. There's different translations where basically Jesus says to Satan, you should not provoke the Lord your God. That's the word that comes up in some Hebrew, some Aztec, some translations. Do not provoke the Lord. And this temptation is important because what he's saying is when you make choices in your life, don't make decisions, don't do things where God is shaking his head and going, what are you doing? Why would you do this? Don't you? We always make sure that we're doing things where the Lord has not only blessed this decision, but he is in the decision. So in the end, what you really have is these three temptations, again, in three key areas. Satan is trying to get Jesus to fill his own needs instead of letting the Father fill what you're hungry for. All of us are hungry for something. We just want to make sure that it is God who is filling that cup and nobody else. All of us want to be recognized. All of us want our moment in the sun. But you can't demand authority or coerce to get authority or power that God did not mean for you to have. You have to wait on his time and his plan. That's the second temptation. And again, the last one is to live in a way where you're not provoking God to shake his head and just look at you. What are you doing? Because in the end, the way that you really can resist temptation is to acknowledge your weaknesses and then build a fortress around them. But the key word is acknowledge. And I'm going to close with one last example, and that example is going to be me. When I was a police officer, I had an opportunity to work in the jails for a bit. And up in the jails, it works pretty basic. The officer brings a prisoner in, you take all his property, put it on a table, the prisoner goes in a cell, you inventory the property, put it in a safe. Later on, the prisoner is transported to another location, their property is united with them, there you go. Well, they brought in a prisoner one night that was arrested from Potawatomi Bingo, a giant casino in downtown Milwaukee. And this guy, he did what a lot of people like to do throughout the country is they'll pull out almost all their life savings or a huge amount, and then they just go around the entire country to different casinos and they gamble in cash. And they gamble until they're either broke or they hit the jackpot. This guy was no exception. So the officers brought him in, took out all his property, laid it on the table, took all his money out, laid it on the table, and there you go. He ended up going to a cell, and they were doing paperwork, and they had to leave for a moment. Well, I was somewhere else that evening working a different something. But I needed something out of this room. So I walked in and I just kind of, here I am. And all of a sudden I look at the table and I'm like, whoa. That's more money than I've humanly seen in my entire life, including Monopoly. Turns out that on the table, in cash, 5s, 10s, 20s, 50s, and 100s, was $189,000 in cash. And I just sat there like, wow. And out of the clear blue, out of nowhere, I heard a voice, Steve, get out of that room now. Okay. And I just left. And I knew God was telling me, we're not going to wait for something to go wrong. Get out of that room. And I was ashamed. Are you kidding me? I'm a police officer. My friends, temptation's temptation. And I'm admitting to that for me to be at that table next to that amount of money was a temptation that was waiting for a bad result. Now, I hope you don't fire me as a pastor. I understand if you do, but I'm just being honest. All of us have that temptation. Put me, being you, put me in a room with fill in the blank, and I will not be able to say no. Then admit it. Just admit that's your weak spot. Build a fortress around it. Do what you need to do so that you and fill in the blank never end up in a room together. never end up at a restaurant together, never end up in a back room, whatever. But the real key to fighting temptation is just be honest what the temptation is. But then, in the end, the way you really fight Satan and temptation is to never assume you see him coming. A lot of times when we think of Satan, we think of this evil person with horns and dressed in a big red onesie, and he's got a pitchfork. Oh, I can see Satan coming. No. He wants to come for us in ways that you can never imagine. So when you know that Satan is coming, when you feel it coming, go ahead, lock up the front door, latch it up, put the padlock on, do what you want to do. But my friends, don't forget to lock the back door as well, because that's really where he's going to come.